Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for joining us
Glad to be with
today.
you.
We know we wanted to talk to you a little bit about the reparations plans that that you have been participating in. Tell us a little bit how you got to I think the group is called MORE, or am I saying it right? Is it MORE?
Yes, it's MORE.
Yeah, it's MORE. Tell us a little bit how you got into that discussion with some of the
Well,
mayors.
I'm very active with the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the California mayors. I was the chair of the big city mayors in California for 2 years between 2017 and 19. And we have a very good network. And Mayor Garcetti, who has a big network, started the MORE Coalition, invited me to participate. And of course, without even blinking an eye, I said yes. But I will say, so let me say this, my whole agenda as mayor of this city, since I started, I'm now in my 5th year, has really been about the broadest form of reparations. That's what my agenda has been about. I ran for this office. I always go back to the basics of it. Sacramento is a wonderful city. It has given me so many opportunities, and I've tried to give back. When I came back to city government after a decade and a half or more away after serving in the legislature, I saw some pretty clear challenges. The city government and all city government really has been focused as its mission on the delivery of what I call basic services, the fundamentals, police, fire, parks, utilities, picking up the garbage, all of the things that have been core functions of municipal government for a long, long time. And that's vital. If you don't do that well or right, you can't do other things. But what I saw, and what I think has been proven true, not just in Sacramento, but throughout the entire country, is that the people are expecting much more from their municipal government. They want us to lead on racial equity. They want us to lead on economic inclusion. They want us to lead on housing, affordable housing and homelessness. And my agenda, I figured, I didn't come back here after these 14 years. Anybody can I think, preside. Sure. But I came back to see if I could breathe some real life into not replacing what we define as the core functions of a city, but expanding the core definition of what a city is about and what a city government's responsibilities should be. And so in my swearing-in speech and all of my State of the City speeches and all of my initiatives, they've had common themes. I've said the following. Sacramento should continue to grow because the old frame used to be that you're pro-growth or slow growth. I don't think that's the debate anymore. I think sustainable growth, because climate has to be integral to our agenda, is necessary if we're going to provide more opportunities for people. That means more industries. That means more jobs. That means more housing. That means more entrepreneurship. We got to grow. Plus, the people of the city want and rightfully deserve more amenities. I was for the King's deal. Yes, it was controversial, but I want more, not less. I want more art and culture. I want more. I want us to develop the waterfront. I want us to attract more technology and innovation and continue to build the food scene. So we've got to grow. Secondly, the growth is only meaningful to me, and I think it's only meaningful to the basic ethics of this community if it is focused on people and communities that have been traditionally disenfranchised. We call it inclusive economic development, and that has been the hallmark of everything that I have done. And so the third tenet of my mayorship has been and continues to be affordable housing and homelessness, which, by the way, has a significant racial dimension to it as well. And so it has not been easy, but I think when I look at the passage of Measure U in 2018, we expanded the sales tax by another ½ cent, about $50 million a year. And I promised that we would spend 80% of that money on our communities, especially our communities of color, especially our African American community and Latino communities. And over the course of the last 3+ years since that measure passed, between the city's general fund and the Measure U fund, we've invested $119 million in exactly what it is I've talked about. And it has been rough because it was a general tax. And so, you know, Victory has 1,000 mothers and fathers. And so that became everybody's money, including the traditional interests that provide the traditional services, including the public safety services. But we have, every budget cycle, we have fought to invest in year-round youth pop-ups, even during the pandemic, to invest millions of dollars out of our CARES funding in small businesses who were trying to survive during the pandemic, in workforce development, where we really are getting into the space of saying that we need to create the career pathways, help create the career pathways for young people, in affordable housing and homelessness, in the diverse creative economy and tourism, which I think is an underpinning of our economy. And even though the work is not 10% done in terms of reducing or eliminating gaps that have persisted for decades and longer in our city and in our society, I do think it is fair to say that the expectation and the culture now around city government is very different. It is now part of the core responsibility of our city to actually attend to growing a modern, inclusive economy and backing it up with real dollars.
Gotcha. So if I can real quick, to your point, so you kind of said, you know, there's a different level of expectation, I think, of people,
Yes.
of their government. How do you anticipate this movement or effort of reparations to kind of evolve and reveal itself to the community?
Well, first thing, I'm not going to make the decisions unilaterally in any way as the mayor of this city. That wouldn't be right. First thing I'm going to do, I mean, I'm wary of study commissions, and that's not what I'm intending. But I am intending to put together a diverse cross-section of leadership in our community, in the African American community, to engage in some public process, to advise me and the city council on what a commitment to reparations should look like. Now, there are many ways to go about this. There is direct payment. And while I think philosophically that's the right thing to do, I also think that's going to require the participation in a very significant way of other levels of government or state, of state and the federal government. I do believe that the reparations opportunity is an opportunity to expand and intensify our commitment to investing in African American businesses, in African American youth, in African American home ownership, in African American nonprofits, and creative economy, and that we ought to fashion a citywide investment plan with city resources that continues to focus but intensifies our effort to invest directly in our African American families, small businesses, and community-based organizations.
Thank you. Again, I see you're a problem solver, and I've obviously given a lot of thought to this. And you know there are different paths that are being explored now. There's the path in Evanston, Illinois. But you did talk a little bit about possible direct payments. When I was at a party over the weekend speaking to mature African Americans at one lady's 72nd birthday party, they were talking about direct payment. And they were also talking about whether or not you could trace your roots back to slavery. In Evanston, they said a different time period. They had a century, pretty much, or even less time. If you lived in the city from this point till 1969, okay. but there are other ways to look at it. So who do you think might qualify for reparations in Sacramento?
Well, again, I think that there are several approaches, as you indicate. I think, again, philosophically, I support direct payments for people who, for anybody who can show that generationally they have been disadvantaged as a result of the original sin. I mean, the word that I keep thinking about when I listen to your question is redlining. I mean, it is the patterns of development in our community that doesn't go back to the Civil War and pre-Civil War. It goes back to the 1960s and 70s. And that, to me, is a perpetuation of the original sin. And so how do we as a city, with our resource base, fashion a series of remedies that repairs some of what we have done as a city over the course of even more modern history that have perpetuated inequality, have perpetuated racism, have perpetuated the pain and suffering that exists today. You know, I recognize from the very beginning, even after the Stephon Clark shooting and the George Floyd shooting, that the issues of police and African American people, especially African American men and young men, are core issues, obviously. But nothing's easy. But it would be a mistake to only focus on those sets of issues and not focus on basic economics and the history of economic inequality and economic racism in our country and in our community. And so again, my thinking is, because I know our tools, right? I know what our tools are. And I know how we have moved the culture over even 4 years to now, I hope it's a given, that when it comes to budget, we're going to create a racial equity lens, which is a tool we are still developing, but even more than a lens, to have a very purposeful strategy to invest real city resources in our communities, and especially our communities of color. I think that is where I begin in terms of fashioning a city response to the call for reparations, and to work with our partners throughout the region, our state and our federal governments, to be part of any strategy that would directly compensate people who have suffered the generations-long stigma and discrimination of slavery.
The Sacramento region is very diverse. If you were to talk to those who might be opposed to reparations in general, without necessarily having a real understanding of what that is, or why they're maybe even be opposed to it, but if you were to have a conversation with them that says, I don't believe in reparations, we've had a black president, we're post-racial America, whatever. We got black millionaires and billionaires, why should there be reparations? What would you say to them?
Well, I would tell you what I do say. Those who say that, can't we look forward and not look backward? Those who say, look at all we have done. I think we should take pride in many of the advances in our society around racial equity, around gender equity, around LGBTQ equity. I think we should take great pride. But the arc of history may bend forward, but it has not bent far enough. It's still out there. It lurks just below the surface, and sometimes it raises its ugly head. Charlottesville. And so if you relent on the fight for racial justice, you are only empowering those who actually want to look backwards and turn backwards. But there's another reason, and that gets to the heart of the reparations issue. We are still living the effects of past overt discrimination. We're still living. Look at our neighborhoods. Look at how people live economically. Look at the housing condition. Look at the percentage of unsheltered homeless people who are African American, way above the percentage of African Americans in our city and our county. And so we are still living with the impacts of what the law used to say. We're still living with the impacts of racially restrictive covenants. We're still living with the impacts of an old style of policing that I think our chief is trying to change, and our department is trying to change, that created the fear. I mean, you know, we said when it comes to policing that when I talk to African Americans about policing, even people, right, I'm not talking about the defund movement, which I'm against. I don't think that's the right way or the right frame. I think we need police. But when I talk to African Americans, it doesn't matter what socioeconomic category they find themselves in. They largely say the same things. We tell our kids, our teenage boys essentially, especially to be very, very careful when they're out there. And if you're stopped by a police officer, to not do anything that would potentially provoke. And it's stunning to me how consistent it is. And so we're still living with, we're not post-racial. That's a fallacy. Being colorblind is sort of it's a floor, not a ceiling. I mean, it means that you treat people equally and fairly, regardless of their race. But then you go above the floor and you say, for people who don't have the same chance in life as others, what are we going to do to give them a better chance at life? That's all that it is. And many African American people are still living in disadvantaged circumstances as a direct result of slavery, as a direct result of redlining, as a direct result of attitudes from 20 years ago. And so, to me, you take pride in how far we've come, but you always acknowledge that the work is far from done.
You covered a lot of ground there. In Evanston, they are going to use marijuana tax money to get started. You have hinted at a pretty ambitious approach, a multifaceted approach to reparations, from direct payments to the programs you've already started. Where's the money going to come from?
Well, it's interesting. We are talking, for example, Councilman Chenier, Vice Mayor Chenier and I, about how to create a dedicated fund for investing in young people, in youth. You know, we see what's happening out there with young people in old Sacramento, you know, throughout the city. Too many kids with guns, kids with who seemingly don't have alternatives. And so we're looking at a revenue source. We're looking at a revenue source because I don't want to divide up the existing pie. That's sort of what we did. Well, with Measure U, we added a half cent. So we added $50 million, but it's still part of the same pie. I'm looking at, for example, cannabis as a potential revenue source to establish a multifaceted youth investment fund that would be ongoing. It would not be one time. And so where do you get the money? That's one example of where you could get the money.
You talked about direct payments, and that might go to people a lot older than youth, who have maybe lived some of this way back in the 50s and 60s
Right.
and 70s. Where would that pot of money come from?
Well, again, I think we're going to need the partnership of the state and federal governments if we're going to make payments that are more than symbolic. I think we're going to have to do that. Now, every year we're going to take that $50 million of that second half of Measure U, and we're going to decide what is the highest and best purpose. I am, again, open to making direct reparations a priority. I just want to balance that. I don't want to overpromise just because it's satisfying or sounds right. I want to balance that with putting that money directly into our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, our Homeless Intervention Fund, our Youth Investment Fund, our African American Entrepreneurship Program.
So you said you think you need the assistance of the federal government. Can it be done without the assistance of the federal government? Do you see a path?
I do think that there's a path, but I think it depends on how you define it.
Of course.
How many African Americans do we have in the city of Sacramento, for example?
Mm-hmm. About 70,000?
70,000. So you just start doing the math, right? And depending upon where you draw the line, you're right, older people probably more likely have suffered the direct impacts of redlining, for example, or different philosophy in terms of police practices. But young people living in some of our neighborhoods where we have not traditionally invested enough in youth, they're suffering too. So again, and it may not be the satisfactory answer here, as I know I'm talking to the observer here. I am for direct reparations. I commit to finding a way to get that done. I think the role of city government, in my opinion, is to have an intentional and purposeful funding strategy to benefit communities of color when it comes to economics, when it comes to jobs, when it comes to industry, when it comes to job training, when it comes to youth programming, when it comes to affordable housing and homelessness. It's my basic belief.
The reason I asked if it could be done without the federal government is because I know for decades the John Conyers reparations bill has been floating out there and just hasn't been able to move off center. They talk about there might be a possibility it could maybe move soon, but we don't know. So I was just curious.
Well, I mean, 70,000 people. Just do the math. If it was $50 one time, which would be symbolic, mm-hmm. That's $3.5 million. Right. If it's $500, that's $35 million. That's almost a year of the Measure U funding. So I do think I think direct reparations, to do it in a meaningful way, is going to require a partnership.
Gotcha.
Cool. Well, the Japanese got 20,000, and that was a federal program. Yeah.
And it was a federal program. Yeah. That's right.
I agree. The federal government should be in it, but I'm just curious if there was a path forward with that that you saw.
Well, there's always a path.
Gotcha.
But I just don't want to come in here promising more than
under promise and over deliver.
Under promise and over deliver.
That's right.
But I promise a lot when it comes to investing real dollars in our communities. I do, and I think we've backed it up. But it's just the beginning. And hopefully, by the end of my mayorship, in 3.5 years, the culture will be embedded that investing directly in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our disadvantaged communities, and workforce in affordable housing and entrepreneurship, it's a given part of the city budget as opposed to something that comes and goes depending upon the politics of the moment, because I don't think we can go back.